Clock on the wall says it's time to begin. I know you're expecting to see Dave, but something came up again this week where he's going to be out for 2 weeks again. So I was contacted to fill in, and now's the appropriate time to introduce this material and talk a little bit about that tonight, and then go with the handout that's here. And it's not a commercial because it's not for sale, it's for giveaway. So the backstory to this book, The Shield and the Sword, is a series of articles when I was preaching in Live Oak in the mid to late 90s. I went to the local newspaper, the Swanee Democrat, and talked to the editor, Sue Lamb, after seeing an article in the newspaper, Pastor's Corner or something like that. How do I get in the rotation for that? And she goes, well, we just happen to not have anybody for this next issue, a weekly paper. So I submitted an article and it went in the paper. She called me and said, I don't have anybody for next week. You want to do next week? And 3 years, free of charge. An article about the length of what you're reading. I don't know how many words it is, 300 or 400 words maybe. 3 years, free of charge. Because originally nobody would commit, and then other preachers would move into the area and say, we already got an article, we already got a column. And so this is the first of that series. I don't want to say the best of the articles, but the articles that seem to fit into a group the best. And I don't know, in 1997, I think it was, after that first year, I put this together, and it was comb bound, and Robin and me, we went on the church copier and we printed out about 100 copies and punched the holes in them and put the combs on them. And about 2015, I was all out of those copies. I think we did 300 or 400 of them at the time. The church said it was okay. The elders let me do it. I went through Amazon and had this done. So some of it's been redone enough to at least republish the book, and I've been making it available. It's in several prison ministries have been using it. I've taught it one other time. There's 47 articles in here, plus in the back there's some little snippets, and I'll talk about the little snippet part next week. But I only brought 5 copies of the book tonight, and I gave it to the church about a year ago. The elder said it was okay, so I made the announcement the book's available. It was on the back table for several weeks, and then I pulled the books in. So if you didn't get one and you want one, and you're a member here, let me know, and I'll bring some more copies. And if you're online, if you will call the church office through the week and talk to Aloha, give her your name and address, I'll mail you one free of charge. Anything over that, then we'll talk about how much they would be, but they're not for sale, they're for giveaway. Did y'all get one? Were you here a year ago? I got one left, and I don't need it this evening, so there you go.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I think everybody might have one now. But I'll bring some more next week, and we'll do the same thing. Dave's out with sick grandchildren this week, and he's going to be out of town next week, so here's 2 more weeks of me. So I do apologize. But I gave you a free gift. Some of you got a gift for coming tonight. You didn't even know. It pays to come on Wednesday nights. You might get a free gift. If you'll look at the book, and I know not everybody has it in front of them, I'm just going to read just a few of the titles in there to whet your appetite. There's like 4 sections. I did one on Christian evidence, one on Jesus and his work, one on Christian living, and then because it was just the appropriate time when I was writing it, there were some church issues, but there were as much denominational issues as anything that might have happened within the church. And then the final section was winds of change, which were things that were happening within the church. Those weren't always articles that made it to the paper, but those are articles that I'd used for another paper that I was writing that I published on my own. And then in the back of the book, in the supplement, this new edition, the first edition didn't have them. In Live Oak, we had a little Bible call-in thing called the Bible Minute, and we would advertise it below the shield and the sword. I don't have it with the book that you have. That was the name of that article that came out every week. Down at the bottom, call this number for a Bible encouragement. And so some of those Bible minutes are what's in the back. The very last article in the book is basically my answer to why I'm a member of the Church of Christ. And maybe somewhere down the road, we'll probably look at that article too. I think it's on page 139. So that's kind of the introduction to how all of this got started. In 1996, I graduated the School of Preaching over here in Lakeland. Went ahead and kept studying and went to other schools. I went to Southern Christian in Birmingham, went out to Bear Valley in Denver, and advanced my education. But I've always had a sweet spot, a soft spot, because I've always done summer camp until I got just too old to stay a whole week in the hot sun. I always wanted those junior high age kids. They seem to be the most impressionable. They still want to play with G.I. Joe, but they think they're a man, woman, whatever. So the opportunity was there, perfect for elementary first principles. And so a lot of times when I would teach, that's what I would teach. And so these lessons that are in this book, because I was going to an audience that I didn't know their education level, were very elementary. So when you read these, you might say, well, that's just kind of very simplistic. It's not very deep. It wasn't intended to be deep. Remember, this was a public newspaper, and I was trying to educate those who might not even have any idea of what God's about. So when you read them, they might be very simplistic. I might draw a very easy conclusion from very simple material. But that's kind of how I think, too. I try not to think. Now, I can get in a theological conversation, but the older I get, the harder it is to keep my train of thought going. So coming back to the basics, the simplicity, the first principles, this is like banana pudding to me. This is great. So they are educational. There's enough information in there where you can feel like you've been to a Bible study or at least a religious or a spiritual conversation. And then ultimately, the goal was when I'd write them for them to be evangelistic. And so every article that went in the paper had some, what I would say, a call to action. Something God wants us to do or something I was trying to invoke in people. And I wrote an article on Calvinism. Maybe you know what Calvinism is. We'll probably look at that article. It's in the book. That came out on a Thursday. Came to the church building on Sunday. Actually, I came to the church building on Saturday night to set the air, which is what the preacher does, right? If they live in the parsonage on the same acreage, you come over the night before, you set the air and everything. And I saw something, glass windows, I saw something like attached to the window. So I went out and I looked at it, and it was a challenge from the local Baptist preacher to a debate on Calvinism. And so and then for the next year, the letters to the editor and full-page articles from this gentleman, preacher from the Baptist church, evoked some sort of a stimulus from our elders and said, yeah, let's go ahead and accept the challenge. And so we put together a team, and I had a number of preachers, a couple from Lake City, one from Alachua, and me in Live Oak, and High Springs, and we were available. And we went through all the planning, and then needless to say, it never happened. I did put out all of the material on that. That's in a separate book. It's still in a comb binder. I haven't formally put it together in another fashion yet. But one of the articles from that paper stimulated a year's worth of activity in that community. And aside from being live on the internet, there's some stories there that I'll tell you, but I'll tell you maybe one-on-one or one-on-three or whatever, just because of the way the community responded to the information I was providing, the support I got versus the support he got. And if you know anything about Calvinism, we're not supposed to get that kind of support from the denominational world. So it was an exciting time. It was my first full-time work, and so that article's in here. We'll look at that eventually. But the intent is to share this with others. And so I've been sharing the book for, 20 years now, 25 years. And so I appreciate George and the elders looking at the book and saying, yeah, this is something you can give to the members, and now even have this opportunity to share with you. Let's go ahead and look at the handout. I think that's enough, not even really a commercial, just how it came about and the kind of information that's available on a very elementary level that should encourage and stimulate further thought. So this is actually page 11. This is the first article in the book. And what I'm going to do is I just read through it a little bit, and we'll talk about it. If you've got any questions, any comments. I think there's only just a couple scriptures in this one. Again, remember, this was written for what might be called a secular audience, trying to introduce God, introduce Christianity, introduce the Bible. So it's not overwhelmed with a lot of passages, although some of them did have quite a few passages as I began to mature the product for the audience. But does God exist? And somebody even said, I know the answer to that question. Can I leave? I said, yeah, but the test is on the back. The real question is on the back page. And so we'll take a look at this tonight. Before I begin, any questions or comments about anything? I know I haven't really asked any questions. I haven't really tried to solicit any special information from you, but any comments, anybody? If you did not get a book a year ago, and if you didn't get one tonight, let me know so I know how many I can bring next week, and then we'll go from there. But I'm going to do the handout every week, so don't feel like you have to have the book so that you can follow along, because you'll have this every week. The articles are small enough. Remember, this was a small column, and you could read it in about 3 or 4 minutes, maybe 5 minutes. So we'll probably, unless it's an in-depth article, there's a couple articles that weren't in the paper that were in more of their quarterly circular that are a little bit longer. That might take us a couple weeks to go through. But every time I teach from now on, as long as there's no critique to stop me, we'll do articles from this book, and we'll try to do them kind of in order. And so anybody that might be seeing them online, again, I'm here for the next 2 weeks, so we got the first 2 articles, which might be a good introduction to the material, because this one is Does God Exist? And the next one is Creation versus Evolution. And so those are always timely subjects. But does God exist? The short answer, of course, would be we believe yes. Well, not everybody believes that, because they don't necessarily understand what we mean by God. Is God that which provokes me or moves me or stimulates me to do something outside of me, to be productive? And that's the ultimate question that gets asked later, after we establish the fact that God exists. If God exists, then what does God expect of us? And the expectation has different definitions depending on who you talk to. A lot of people might say God exists because they understand something outside of them, greater than them, maybe moves them, like I said, but not everybody agrees to how that process continues. And so tonight we're just going to establish that God exists. It's elementary, it's fundamental, but if we start here, then I know we all have started here. And that's the way I tried to approach it in the newspaper, was let's start with some elementary things. These creation ideas, or these Christian evidences. And then from there we can move to other things, because we're all on common ground. So, this is indeed a question that must be answered. Now, I don't necessarily mince my words. When I say something like that, I expect somebody to take a pause between the words and think about that. Why is this such an important question? Maybe from your perspective, why is it important to decide or satisfy that God either does or does not exist? Why is that important? I've kind of given you the commentary to that to answer the question, but in a short answer, because remember, these are evangelistic. Well, why do I even need to know that? What would be your answer? Don't mean to put you on the spot necessarily, but if something comes to you right away.
The foundation. It's the foundation of what we believe, what life is.
Okay.
It's a foundation.
I think the second part of your answer was probably, in a truest sense, and I think Matt had a comment, and then Jim, and then we'll come back and visit that. So go ahead to Jim. You're right there.
I would say, to answer the question, do or do I not have a purpose?
Okay. All right. Yeah. It answers that question, is what you're saying. Okay.
Yeah, my comment was very similar. It is the structure behind lots of answers, like where did everything come from to what is the meaning of life,
Okay.
things like that.
Yeah, yeah. Keith's got a comment up here too.
With the establishment of God, it calls, or it follows a natural order to then what is my behavior? So the short answer in society would be morals, I guess.
Okay.
So am I to be moral or act in a moral way because there either is or isn't a God?
Okay. All right. Henry's got a comment too.
What's going to define my relationship with others that are around me?
Okay.
What am I supposed to do with all these other people?
Okay. Yeah, and I think as you see, it's not as easy to answer. We almost want to begin to give our philosophy for the answer, which is appropriate. A lot of times we want to give why I need to know God exists. But and all of that is, everything is true. Everything absolutely is true. This question must be answered because I need to know where I came from. Somewhere in life, and usually it's puberty, somewhere between 10 and 15, we start asking the question, how am I different than my parents, so to speak, or something like that. Remember, we don't want to get too theological because we're dealing with elementary folks when we introduce this idea, because a lot of people don't even know that they need to know whether God exists or not. They're just believing to believe. I'm a productive member of society, therefore I'm a good person. I don't, harm, hurt, or put anyone in danger. Therefore, I'm a good person, and that's all they care about. But it kind of goes back to the morality question, or what dictates, or who has decided, or why am I here? What am I supposed to be doing? And how does that impact not just me, but the people outside? And about 10 to 15, we start thinking about that. How does my life impact other people? Prior to that, it's all about me. And some people grow to be 35 and it's still all about me, right? And so they need the elementary approach. Does God exist? They may not think about it like that, but if we know how and where we came from, it will change how we approach day to day. Does that make sense without being too theological? Okay. The evidence is overwhelming. Of course, God exists. So when I say the evidence is overwhelming, immediately I solicit, well, what's some of that evidence? Or there is no evidence for God. So when we approach people, I'm helping us understand that there's ways to say things to stimulate a response, and a positive response. Well, what's some of the evidence? If there is no God, then almost anything goes. That's a declarative statement. That's a judgment on my part. I don't have any evidence for that statement other than that's what I believe. And so we begin to realize this person has a plan. I firmly believe that if there is no God, anything goes. And I think that's kind of already been said, maybe not in so many words. It does, however, appear to be the case in some parts of the world that they either don't believe in God or there is no God there, right? And that's what the world thinks. Either there is no God there or God doesn't care, because obviously that wouldn't be happening. There's an article later on in the book that deals with some of those issues. That's not tonight's discussion, again, because it goes back to the elementary. To prove the existence of God is not that difficult. It's really, I'll say, common sense. If people would really just stop to pause for a minute. We may not know who God is, we may not have an intimate relationship with God, but we can prove that God exists. It just depends on what God means. The hard part is getting people to accept, and this is the part that's kind of your quiz, and it's asked again on the backside. The hard part is getting people to accept that He continues to expect worship from His creation. How do we know that God expects something from us? I mean, we kind of have that moral compass, If it's been trained properly, it will stimulate that activity. Again, so it's not so much knowing that God exists. Ultimately, it's knowing that God exists and He expects something from us. And so that would be my ultimate goal in any of these subsequent articles on creationism is, what does all of this mean in my relationship to God? It kind of goes back, I guess, to the Discovery Bible studies. What does the passage say? What does it mean? What does it say about God? What does it say about me? What's my response? That same kind of approach is the God question. How am I supposed to respond to this information? Each creature, and I use the term creature on purpose, each creature has a continued obligation to God. But that's a topic for another time. I chose just 3 evidences that I think are pretty simplistic enough that we should be able to have a conversation this evening about these. So if you'll allow me to read the first one, and then we'll talk about it. Then we'll read the second one and we'll talk about it. And we'll read the third one and talk about it. And then maybe we'll solicit some input about which one you prefer. We'll talk about the specific proof first as a proof, the pros and cons of is that effective or not. And then maybe we'll ask you which one do you normally try to use and maybe generate some discussion about that. And then our time will be up for this evening. So let me read the first one. Cosmological, fancy way of saying cause and effect. There was a cause that led to something happening. Something caused something to exist, or the response to that cause is this. Again, that might be a little theological, but I don't know how else to explain that other than as we read this, maybe it'll trigger some thoughts in your head. Where did man come from? Something caused me to be here. Now, I know mom and daddy, and I know how all that works. And that's not the question. The question is, how did man, human being, come about? Some would say he evolved. Others say he simply appeared by non-miraculous means, or the Big Bang Theory. We can talk about the Big Bang Theory. Regardless of where man came from, remember, regardless of where he came from, he is the result of cause and effect. Man is the effect of some act. What caused man? Was it parents, grandparents? What about the first man and woman? What about before man? What about from the beginning? And those are all ask or open-ended questions that help remind somebody that it's more than just, we're here, I don't know where I came from. It's not about knowing necessarily where you came from. The first argument says, you're here. Now, where did you come from? And you say, well, I come from my mama, my granddaddy, on generation and generation. What about them? Where did they come from? And then we go all the way back to somewhere. Something was before man. What was before man? People say, well, that was the dinosaurs. Okay. So then the dinosaurs produced man, or man came as a result of dinosaur interaction. And we can take it to the absurd sometimes to get people to think. Where did we come from? Did we evolve? Okay, we evolved from what? Are we continuing to evolve? We've had however many. And so the cause and effect is a great argument. It may not be singularly an argument to convince, but it ought to get us to think. Any comments or any input about how that's used or how you understand that? Where did man come from? As a Christian, where do we say he came from? God created. We came from creation, out of nothing. And we can't say out of nothing. Where did we come from? Physically, where did we come from? Did we come from another planet and God brought Adam and Eve here and planted them on this planet and that's how we began to produce? From clay. From the things of this earth. There's enough physical evidence in the body scientifically to prove that we came from right here. The only thing that can't be proved scientifically necessarily is the animation, is that which brings the life part. So the cause and effect, we are here, how did we get here? That's pretty powerful on an elementary level. When you're trying to get somebody to think about who they are, it doesn't answer all the questions. Any questions or comments about that first element or that first argument for the existence of God? We still don't know who God is, right? We might even say, well, it came from like the Big Bang Theory. Well, even the Big Bang Theory has particles, elements, right? So where did that come from? Take it all the way back to before anything. And if that is God, or if that is pre-existence, then there's your question. Where did man came from? He came from that pre-existence and came into being somehow. Do you think that's pretty important for this world to understand that we are not the king of our domain necessarily? That we might actually be accountable to something outside of us. Remember we talked about puberty and when they begin to think, those adolescent period where they begin to think, maybe there is, and that's going to come to the third argument. Number 2. Teleological. Teleos. I forgot to look up that word tonight. Does anybody know what teleos is? It's not telescope.
Having to do with purpose.
Okay, having to do with purpose. There is a design and a designer. This one, you've probably heard this. The designer is naturally greater than the design. Think of the complexity of the world, the universe, even man. Now decide that all this was generated in a cataclysmic explosion without source or origin. If you discovered a working computer in the desert, miles from any source of electricity, would you consider it A, to evolve from lower plant life, B, to materialize from thin air, or C, manufactured by a higher source of intelligence and placed there? Now, I do realize that the CPU or the unit in there that's supposedly like the brain of the computer is made from some form of silica, which is the same thing that's in sand. But I'm not willing to say that the computer just built itself from years of compression under the sand and then it just popped up like a rose would pop up out of a bush. Does it not make sense? And when I say sense, we've got to realize that the world doesn't think sensibly. They don't even think practically. They think selfishly. And so if this doesn't fit their, is it a paradigm? If it doesn't fit their pattern, they don't want to accept it. Doesn't mean it's not true. It just means they don't want to accept it. So the teleological argument says, if there is something here, and it has, and I use the term animation a lot. If it has animation, if it has the ability to express, communicate whatever that animation is, maybe just walk. Something greater than it put it into motion. Is that a fair statement? Can we get the world to think like that? Or are we having a hard time getting the world to think like that? Are they choosing not to accept that for some reason? Have you ever dealt with someone in a study? I had a guy that when I was in Lake Butler and generating these articles on a recycle, so to speak, in another community, that every time I wrote something like this or discussed something like this, either on the radio, telephone, newspaper, he would call me and approach me and he'd say, yeah, but what about this and what about this? And all he was doing was creating straw men for me to spend all of my time and energy at 30 years old and never actually being able to convince him of anything because he'd already made up his mind. There was no God. And that we're just the product of evolution, and that the animation part and even the ability to make judgments, decisions about circumstances and take the evidence and make an individual decision were all a part of the natural course or order of things. without a design or purpose. Did you have a comment? Okay. But the designer is that complementary to the first one. If we can say that we are here because of something, and now that we are a special something, then something special or greater than us had to have brought us into existence. Not everybody, I might would be fine. I'm not fine. But for the argument purposes, I would be fine if someone could prove that evolutionary development brought me from some other creature, say like a monkey. But then that would have to suggest that the monkey ultimately was greater than me, and I was just the natural product of that monkey's development. And that, are we willing to settle that? Are we willing to settle on the fact that now the greater is that which is down the line? We'll talk about creation evolution next week with I introduced it with the second law of thermodynamics 2 weeks ago, I guess it was. But that idea that if things are in decline, how can I be greater and actually overtake that which created me? That's that circular reasoning that people don't always think through. And unfortunately, when we're looking at someone who doesn't believe in God, we've got to start somewhere with just the basics. Just that elementary thought of, here's the cause and here's the effect. I'm here. Look at the advanced state of this development. And after 60 years, I can see in 60 years this thing declining. I can't do what I did at 10. Well, I can do more than I could do at 10, only because now I'm 6 foot tall. But I can't bend over to pick something up without something hurting, right? So you see the decline. So how do we explain that? If the life expectancy, and extra biblical, we're not talking about the Bible to make these arguments, extra biblical, everyone sees their body declining, and yet they want to say that creature was able to develop and mutate or advance into something greater instead of something lesser. I don't know. My Jethro brain just can't accept that. It just doesn't make sense to me. And if it doesn't make sense, it's probably, in my mind and heart, it's not true. Even before I was a Christian, I knew the stars meant something. I knew the moon meant something. I just didn't know what it meant until I began to be exposed to the fact that these things were there for our benefit. Wow! But that comes by declaration, not by observation. And that's pretty amazing when you think about, I've looked up in the stars for 50 years, and I guess they're called constellations. I'm not a scientist, I'm not an astrologer, but I go camping at Withlacoochee, and every once in a while they've got an astronomy club from St. Pete that goes out there with these huge telescopes, and they stare out into space. And I asked one of them one time, has any of those stars ever moved? I'm like, nope, I've been doing this for 60 years. That star has always been X, Y's. It's never moved. How is that even possible? So the Big Bang and those things stayed put, right? And this Earth kind of stayed put, and it's got some morphing things that have happened to it through science, but an amazing design. I mean, we could even go as far as to talk about, we've got some doctors and nurses and, people that know the inside of the body, mental health wise, and primarily physically, we're fearfully and wonderfully made. I mean, we understand that. And the world says, well, that's amazing. Yeah, that's amazing. How did that happen? I bet he evolved. And I'm not being condescending or not trying to be ugly, but I'm trying to say that the evidence is there. People just got to want to look at it. Any questions or comments before we go to the last one? Y'all might get out early tonight. Oh, I can read a Bible minute though. Jim?
This may be, well, I think this is related to the teleological,
Okay.
but I don't think most atheist people that don't believe in God will start with science. In fact, I don't think you'd find it in their top 5 or 10 reasons why they think God does not exist. Take someone that, let's say their 10-year-old child was killed in a terrible accident, not because the result of some sin or some action by someone else. Maybe it was a weather event. Maybe it was just a freak accident. They're going to say, why? Why would a good God, if God exists, why would he allow such a thing? So really, their whole stand is more about those kind of philosophical questions, which are, they're not bad questions. I think there is an answer. And I think sometimes we have to say, like if you talk about why are there starving people in Asia or Africa or somewhere that they had no choice where they grew up and what they became and why, that doesn't seem fair. If God were real, he would be a fair God. Now, some of those things I can't answer, but I do think there's an overall answer for us when we look at the big picture of the story God has woven.
Amen.
Through the scriptures.
Amen.
And in our own personal lives. But I think it starts with these philosophical questions. The science stuff is just trying to explain to fit their, philosophical objection to God.
Mm-hmm. And what I would say, 2 things I would say to that, and then I think Henry's got a comment, George, is exactly what happened in Lake Butler. I got sidetracked by those questions, thinking, if I answer those questions faithfully, then that person will come around. Then I realized that without common ground, we were debating on 2 different subjects. So your question is valid. The majority of those who either don't understand how God works or don't want to believe or understand how God works, choose those methods either intentionally or unintentionally to trip us up. If we go back to the elementary beginning, where did you come? And at least, can we have some common ground there? And that's when the conversation stopped. When I tried to come to common ground, what do we believe together? Where did you come from? Well, I don't know. Well, let's talk about, and we talked about some of these arguments. Do you believe these things are true? How do we explain that? Well, I don't know how to explain that. Well, let's start right there then, and then we can move forward. Let's at least agree that these things are reasonable or possible. But yes, we're all the time being sidetracked by people that I would never question their motives, but maybe their understanding of where we're trying to go. But yeah. And we will answer those questions. We'll try. Henry.
So just kind of like tailing off of what Jim was talking about, atheists. So a lot of times, So a lot of times, the arguments that atheists use against God are the qualities and the attributes are like the idea of fairness. That's a man-made construct, in a sense. But you can't take the attributes that are attributed by Christian values and use those as an argument against God. Am I making any sense?
Right. Don't use God to dismiss God.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah. So if we have and that's this number 3, if we can agree that cause and effect, and if we can agree designer, and if we can agree that we have a moral or some sense of oughtness, that's the 3rd one. Then we got to start somewhere.
Who should die
Yeah.
and who should not die. and what's fair and what's not fair. Those are things that we come up with.
Yeah. Those are what make us a special creation. Yeah. Great, absolutely. That brings us perfectly into the third one. If we can get the elementary beginning on these 3 points, we've got common ground to do everything else. Will you agree that you're here? Yes. Will you agree that you're special in some way? They may argue with that, but yeah, I can do things that a dog can't do. I've got appendable thumbs. I think it's appendable, right? Opposable. Yeah, thank you. Opposable thumbs. I can do things that, I'll say, lower creatures can't. Well, what makes me higher than them is because I can do more. Just like an elephant would be higher than me because of what it can lift and things like that. But so we can agree. This third point is what separates us from all other creatures, at least in my understanding. I mean, there's been people tried to study the intelligence of other created beings, but I don't see anybody like us. Number 3, the awareness of right and wrong. Remember, I wrote this when I was not really naive, but in a very simplistic. This is the hardest one to have a discussion with somebody about, because it goes into these little side thoughts. Well, yeah, if that's true, then how and why, and then we all kind of get lost because we don't really know where to go next. So we basically stop the conversation. And sometimes it's okay just to stop the conversation and just, we know what we can do. We can pray. Pray that the seed be planted, continue to water, and what comes next? God gives the increase if the soil's right. This is really an extension of the cause and effect, or the cosmological argument. To have a sense of right and wrong, atheists will deny this ability. We cannot know right from wrong. Most atheists, if you pin them down, they're atheists because they say there is no right or wrong. If you've ever read anything from an atheist, one of the things is it's usually situational ethics or groupthink or whatever is survival. Whatever I can survive, the survival of the fittest, those kind of mentalities. When it boils right down to it, that's what they believe. Not always. So with the